Before you tune in to this week's episode of The Open Book, please be warned that this discussion covers the themes of sexual assault, rape, and harassment. Please take care when listening to this week's conversation, and please take caution when engaging with the resources used for this week. Okay, so this week on The Open Book, we'll be discussing rape culture. So this week we engaged with several resources on the topic, including TED Talks from Ines Herkovich, a sociologist with expertise on sexual violence, Jackson Katz, a leadership mentor, the reading Benevolent Sexism from Ladies First to Asking for It, as well as several other resources that can be found on our website. So in terms of an agenda, each talking point will be about 15 minutes each, and we'll try and get as much in as possible. So the first point, I'll go through the points one by one. So first is, how do our preconceived notions of rape / sexual assault / harassment contribute to a culture of rape and misogyny? And what are the effects of victim blaming on how women report rape? Secondly, how does benevolent and hostile sexism contribute to the victimization of women? And how does it continue to perpetuate rape culture? Thirdly, how do we eradicate this problem in the remainder of the 21st century? Is it possible? And do we rely on laws or norms? And lastly, why must we consider gender violence / sexual violence a men's issue more than a woman's problem? So I guess we'll start with the first point. So mainly this first point was sort of derived from the first TED Talk that was featured on the resources list, which was by Ines Herkovich, who is a sociologist who is an expert on sexual violence. And it was talking about like why women stay silent after sexual assault. And so I guess if anyone wants to sort of speak on that, if anyone has any points that they derived from watching the video and what they learned and what they kind of gained from that. Okay, I guess I'll just go. So unless anybody else wants to. Okay, so I guess what I sort of derive from it is the fact that the culture of rape is almost so pervasive that women begin to blame themselves for sexual assault, and we almost like gaslight ourselves to the point where we don't speak up, because I think this is also addressed in the 63-page JSTOR article on benevolent sexism about how women are, expected to box themselves into like this idea of like the good female, and to sort of be a victim of sexual assault would to step out of that box of what the good female is. And so because suddenly, and also not just that, but I think in the TED Talk she was talking about how like a lot of women feel like their rape is not legitimate because they weren't like resisting, because in the eyes of the law you sort of need to have like visible marks or signs of resistance, when in a lot of cases, particularly in the sort of example that was raised during the TED Talk, women often not necessarily give in, but they give up, and they find that, in order to prevent further violence or worse harm to their psyche and to their body, they end up just giving up. And in the example that we saw in the TED Talk, the woman, Anna, literally said, "Can you just do it quickly and just take me home?" Which I found really shocking. But at the same time, I think for anybody, woman or man, who finds themselves in a position and in a dynamic where they feel powerless, you often feel so afraid for your own life, and you want to prevent as much harm as possible that you do kind of give in to the assaulter, which I think also contributes to this idea of like, because that's what we think rape is so violent, but in reality it's a lot more, it involves more coercion and manipulation than we think. Okay, Daria has raised her hand.
So after like watching that TED Talk, what really stuck with me was particularly the beginning, after the presenter talked about Anna's story. The questions that she started asking were targeted towards the victim rather than towards the actual rapist. So they were asking, so like some questions that she said we could be having in our heads are, why doesn't she open the window and jump out? Why doesn't she say it sooner? Why didn't she like say no to him taking her home from the club? But in reality, the problem doesn't lie within women who trust men, because we should be living in a society where both genders shouldn't be harming each other. But so you can't be directly targeting all of the problems towards women. And so often women feel like they shouldn't be reporting their rape because it should be in their power to stop it, when in reality, sometimes situations get so out of hand where there's absolutely no way of going around it. And I think that's the worst situation, where women get targeted for what they've done, when in reality they were just trying to see the benefit, or like the positive in the opposite sex, or just another person that ultimately did bring harm to them without them sort of thinking about it in advance.
Sean.
Yeah. So okay, I think I'll just start by saying, I mean, this entire topic, I think for the remainder of this call, I think Akmal and I might find it a little bit harder to, you know, sympathize and, you know, relate to what this actually is about. But I think to start off with the talk, I think that really was an eye opener. I mean, when she started speaking about, you know, the concept of rape, and, you know, when you think of it, I mean, from what the media portrays it as, it's portrayed as this violent thing, you know, and realistically, no, it's actually quite normalized. I mean, it can happen in many situations that when a woman would actually speak about, you know, it's actually quite hard to believe that that actually happened. Not that, you know, I mean, I think humans have a tendency to only speak about things that are, you know, violent and loud. And I mean, earlier today, I was reading this book about human irrationality, and they were saying the fact that, you know, in 2004, of all the crimes and all like the robberies that happened in the world, the amount of money stolen was around 500 million US. But of all, in that same year, of all the employee crimes in terms of corruption and fraud, the amount stolen was half a trillion US, which is like obviously what, significantly more, right? But realistically, when you look at the media, what do you see? You see a lot more about crimes. You know, if you look at movies, if you look at, you know, the way crime is portrayed, you look at these guys in masks in like a bank or something like that. And I guess that's just the way humans portray information. And I think the same thing happens with rape as well. And I think it's just really interesting that that's what humans usually like to do, you know. But yeah.
Um, yeah, about like the media, I think we'll also talk about this when we talk about like the articles that were part of the resource list. But I think that like because the media influences us a lot, regardless of like what we want to like tell ourselves. It really informs us about things that we often don't experience in real life, or in like in our own lives. And I think that like the media, especially in its sort of obsession with like gratuitous violence and crime, has informed how we view rape and has informed these preconceived notions of what rape is as this like violent and like penetrative act. Um, and it almost reduces it down to like individual incidents rather than like sort of an epidemic in society, and like a sort of a symptom of like patriarchal violence and male dominance in our culture, which like i guess I guess in that way, like because of that and because of how the media informs us, it also informs like the questions that we tend to ask victims. Like Daria was talking about how like a lot of these questions are directed at victims, and I think because of us being obsessed with like what we think rape is, and like we're sort of convinced like that is what rape is, it sort of dismisses like the actual trauma of the victims and like the things that they had to go through. And I think that's why so many victims decide to stay silent, because I think the Ines Herkovich was saying that like, you know, hearing questions and hearing doubts and, you know, suspicions from people that you confide in about your assault is might even be far worse than the assault itself, which I think is like pretty heartbreaking in general. And I think that, you know, I think the media really has a role to play in that because of how, first of all, I think it's talked about in the benevolent sexism reading, but the fact that, like, first, we have a very warped view of what proper consent is. And secondly, like, we view rape too often as just super violent, perpetuated and perpetrated by strangers rather than it's oftentimes family members and acquaintances. So yeah, I think in terms of like if we're moving on to the conversation about like how do we reduce that, how do we help eradicate rape culture, it starts with like how do we address how sex and consent and sexual assault is portrayed in the media. Okay, new.
Obviously, this is a hard thing to bring up, but I have a friend at home who have been like victim to this, and obviously in an Asian culture, um, women especially are very, stereotypical household, submissive, just gets on with like babies, household things. But the reason why that um, my friend, she didn't feel like she could come forward with the family is because they're viewed as weak. If you tell your parents that you were a victim to this, they blame you for being weak, for not fighting back. And that speaks so loudly because through all the resources that, we read for today, that's a prevalent theme where it's in the eyes of the law that defines rape, where in society, in reality, it's not similar to that. It's so much more than that. And I think that's where the problem lies, is that people have this misconception of what rape is because of the eyes of the law, which in turn influences media, which in turn influences culture, because we listen to the law, right? Like obviously, but I think that's where the misinformation kind of goes around and in turn affects the victims.
Okay, Daria, I think you raised your hand.
Yeah, sorry, my internet. But what I was gonna say is, I think almost the most basic thing that sort of holds victims back from speaking up about what has happened to them are like small nasty comments that sort of go back to like sexism, where a lot of men and sometimes women always say sort of like, don't dress a certain way, you're kind of asking for it, which is an awful statement, which is just a ridiculous and stupid statement to say in the first place. But I feel like that is one of the main reasons why people sort of, well, victims in particular, sort of just stay quiet, because people start like picking at their sort of behaviors and them as people rather than as that situation, and sort of um, try to find the flaws in the victim rather than the flaws in the rapist, just to sort of say that all this happened only because you're this kind of person. Like maybe you dress a certain type of way that could be seen in society as, sort of more open, when in reality, the problem never sort of lies in the victim, because they were never asking for it, they never wanted it, and it happened to them because of someone that just didn't think about them or how they were feeling or what they were wearing or what they were doing. They already had their mind set on what they wanted to do, and all of those other factors just make it in quotes okay for the rapist to do what he's done.
Yeah, I think like Daria's sort of statement about like the questions that are asked, like little comments. Herkovich called it questions that aren't really questions, but rather judgments. And I think like you're right. I think that has a huge role to play in why victims remain silent. And I know that in like a lot of like Asian cultures and in a lot of religions, I think because of the certain things that we're taught about sex and the way we're taught about like the male female dynamic also informs that as well, because then it's always seen as like the woman's fault, because like I know for in Islam, for example, there's this whole tenet about like men and women shouldn't be in the same room together. Like you can't be in a room alone with a man. And sort of, I know that's been used as like justification to say like, okay, but like if the woman's been raped, why were you alone in the room with a man, rather than why would that man rape you, or like, stuff like that. And I think like what you're talking about like women who, I think when we see like women who dress like promiscuously and, or whatever promiscuous means, or slightly more openly and less modestly, I would define that as like the non-conforming woman. And like even then, we're so obsessed with this idea of like the good victim and like the conforming woman, but like why does that why does the law then assume that they are deprived of the right to not be sexually violated? That's, the big question, Um, yeah. Okay. So we're going to move on to the second point, which is how does benevolent and hostile sexism contribute to the victimization of women, and how does it continue to perpetuate rape culture? So this is in reference to the reading on benevolent sexism from Ladies First to Asking for It, which is sort of a law reading. And we can start from there if anyone wants to start and talk about that and what they sort of learned and from engaging in that resource. Okay, I'll start again. Okay, so basically I think like what I sort of gained from that learning and from that reading and like how I engaged in it is sort of benevolent sexism and this idea of chivalry, the idea that like a man should protect a woman, it's obviously really messed up, but it also I think justifies cycles of abuse by convincing women that basically they need to strip themselves of their own agency because men need to protect them from like what we see as like hostile sexism, like directly hostile sexism, rather than the benevolent sexism that sort of views women as without agency, as people that need to be protected, as people who can't really make decisions and whose decisions lie in the hands of men rather than themselves. And I think like because of that, it reinforces this sort of gender divide, the idea that like men and women and the whole like gender binary, like they're two separate things, when in reality men and women are exactly the same. It's just society has defined gender by different characteristics because of like the evolution of like our culture. And I think as like a result of that, and as a result of like benevolent sexism, not only has it like perpetuated cycles of abuse, but I think it romanticizes abuse to an extent, because like when you strip a woman of their agency, you you dehumanize her, and you don't view her as somebody who can make her own decisions and who is worthy of respect because she's a human being. She's worthy of respect because she conforms to like what a good woman is. And because of that, we've romanticized sort of manipulation and coercion. And the reading was like talking about how like a lot of things that we see, especially in the media, of how like men will just assume that like a woman doesn't know what she wants out of like a romantic encounter, so he'll initiate a kiss even though that kiss wasn't necessarily wanted from the woman, but because the man has stripped her of her agency, dehumanized her, and assumed that like, oh, she doesn't know what she wants, and there's like this whole idea of like blurred lines. I think that in itself just, it basically dilutes consent and thus perpetuates this culture of rape that continues to silence victims and allows for rape to be such, to be so common among, women. Yeah. So Daria?
I think benevolent sexism and the term like gentleman um, have a very like blurred line between them, because obviously, we all know what gentlemen are, in quotes again, meant to do. But after reading this, I found a lot of similarities between benevolent sexism and being a gentleman. And so I think that also sort of it can be quite challenging for men who have zero intentions of, um, putting any harm on a woman, to accidentally step over those like blurred lines, and as a result, sort of like find a different like power within them to you stepping over that line and portraying whatever they're doing as a gentleman's act, when in reality, gaining that power over women allows you to sort of assert your dominance a lot faster and quicker. And as a result of that, it kind of turns into hostile sexism, it turns into domestic abuse, rape, etc. So I think that blurred line between our society's like gentleman views versus benevolent sexism have a lot to do with how men sort of transition into that sort of innocent romance, and that could quickly turn into sort of saying that a woman is dating you and she loves you, and so consent is no longer needed, and therefore turns into things such as domestic abuse and rape.
Do like the guys want to say anything? Because not to say that obviously this is not assuming that anyone here perpetuates benevolent sexism, but like perhaps have after this reading, have you maybe reconsidered the way that you interact with like the woman in your life, or like perhaps the preconceived notions and behaviors that you're sort of accustomed to? Have you like reconsidered that afterwards? Because like I think I really reconsidered like perhaps these advances from a man, maybe because like I'm so afraid of hostile sexism, perhaps this benevolent sexism, it's not any better, but it pacifies me because I just think it's a better alternative to being like sexually assaulted, when in reality it objectifies me and uh strips me of my agency. Like has any mindset sort of shifted for you guys?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, obviously, I haven't been able to experience anything because I've been the only people I've seen as my family, obviously, from that point. But yeah, I mean, I've started to like think about it, and I've realized a lot more. I mean, I come from a culture, an Indian culture, where there's a lot of sexism, like a lot of sexism, where women are meant to be in the kitchen, nowhere else. And one of the most common terms that you would hear is, no, 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 it's fine. She knows. I mean, no, no, no. This is what she wants. And trust me. Like, it's always the man who, apparently knows what the woman wants. And it's just been said so many times up to the point where it's just normalized, and it's just such a norm in that culture now, where even if you step out of it, and if a woman says something like, no, 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 that isn't what I want. You have no clue what I want. That woman isn't seen as independent. That woman is seen as, oh, she's radical. There's something wrong with her. She should be checked up. You know what I mean? And I guess I mean, I haven't seen that obviously in my life, but when I look at like my like Indian grandparents, as like sisters and stuff like that, who still think like that, and they tell me stories about that. I mean, it just makes me realize how much that actually, how much that actually happened. And now that I read about it, I mean, yeah, it was just really, really eye opening, I guess.
Yeah, I guess same for me, honestly. Because usually you don't really look at benevolent sexism. You only really look at hostile sexism. So then, when I got to read about it, I really learned something new, and made me realize that how the culture and norm that we live in is actually quite wrong in a sense. And I think it's just really sad to see that um, these types of benevolent sexism go unseen, mostly in society, especially I mean from Malaysia as well. Not gonna lie, there is a lot of sexism as well. Um, so yeah, for me, it's really eye opening.
Yeah, I think that like because of I think what Sham was saying about like, oh, like the man suddenly knows what like the woman wants, even though that might not be true, but because of like the whole culture of like male dominance, the woman might be too afraid to speak up. That in itself like blurs lines of consent. And I think it's spoken about in the reading about like acquaintance rape. And I guess like for example, I guess if you were having friendly relations with that man, and because of like benevolent sexism and like what we see it as like a man trying to be like chivalrous and trying to be like a gentleman, it's sort of for a lot of women, I guess, who are victims of sexual assault and harassment, it for them it the legitimacy of like the whole act of sexual assault is suddenly shaky ground for them, because they're thinking like, oh, but this guy was like super nice to me, and I mean, I guess I was like trying to like pacify him. I guess I was like trying to be this and that because he was being nice to me because he's a gentleman or whatever. And then you know I guess from that the man sort of assumes the consent of the woman, even though she might not like actually give it, but because like the man takes control or whatever. And I guess because of that, like I never really thought of it because like I guess when we engage in media and like we engage in like rom-coms and like romance novels, you think like, oh, it's so nice, this guy's a gentleman, he wants to protect me, when in reality, like, this is actually really harmful. Like, sure, in the individual instances, like, it might feel nice, but it's rooted in like misogyny and actually like cycles of abuse that are incredibly harmful, you know, to women. And yeah, that's what I have to say about it. If anyone else has anything. Anyone else? Because I think like another point from like what I've written down is one of the most interesting things that I've taken from this is the fact that a lot of rape occurs because of verbal pestering and coercion, which like I spoke about before, how like when we view rape as violent, it sort of misconstrues what rape actually ends up being, which is just a lot of the time people pushing onto you and putting you in a position where you feel uncomfortable and you feel as though like, okay, maybe they were nice to me, so maybe I do have to give in, but that's not actually like enthusiastic consent. Yeah, and I think like this benevolent sexism stuff also sort of unfortunately like continues to perpetuate this idea that like women are submissive and men are dominant, thus men know best, and only men know what a woman want out of like a sexual or romantic encounter, which I think, again, it's been said time and time again like throughout this conversation, but it really does blur the lines of consent, which at the end of the day, it's not solid consent. And whenever you engage in a sexual encounter, I think it needs to be made clear like you need to ensure that boundaries are respected and consent is made clear by both parties. Daria.
Um, just following on from what Zara said, she mentioned a bit of like sort of verbal abuse, sort of almost like gaslighting a victim into thinking of that's what she or he wants. I think a lot of like the conversation that we've had thus far was mainly focused on sort of women getting raped by men, but in reality, there's also it goes any way with any gender, any sexual orientation, regardless, you know, non-consensual sort of sexual interactions, whether it be, you know, anything from intercourse to anything else in between that, kissing, hugging, whatever. I think just the whole like gaslighting in general victims into thinking that is what they want in general, coming from anyone, men, women. You know, women can also be um, rapists. Just it's just not spoken about enough, I think. And as much as it is primarily men, I did want to just touch a little bit on like rape within all sexual orientations and all genders, as that is such a big issue as well. So yeah.
Well, what I found quite interesting about what you were saying, Dara, I think a bit earlier about the fact that, you know, the concept of a gentleman, and you know, I mean, when you think about what it is or what the media portrays as this person who's a gentleman, you think of this, you know, this superior person who, you know, respects women, who, you know, if you would see him in a movie, it would be some guy who's in a suit. And I just think it's quite, you know, I mean, the fact that we're saying that you have to be this superior person to respect women is, I mean, it's a bit sad. It's almost like saying that the majority of people aren't respecting women, and that to be in that, you know, sort of section, you have to be this gentleman figure. So I just thought that was a bit, you know, yeah.
Yeah, I think the media definitely like romanticizes like chivalry a lot, and I think it kind of sort of unfortunately makes us romanticize manipulation and coercion. And you know, I think a lot of the stuff like that we're discussing, not just today, but in previous sessions about, you know, societal structures and social constructs, we have to sort of examine, are a lot of the things that we romanticize and a lot of things that we think are normal, are they actually rooted in violence and misogyny? Are they rooted in, you know, really archaic ideals that are actually super harmful, although for, you know, some of us it seems really nice? Yeah. Okay, so I think we're wrapping it up for this point. And I did say that the third point was about how do we eradicate this in the 21st century, but I think that seems more of like a final concluding point. So I think that we should move on to talking about the Jackson Katz TED Talk, which was basically about why violence against women, why sexual assault is a men's issue more than it is a woman's issue. And I guess like I want to preface by saying that like sexual assault occurs a lot of the time to it's a majority to women, but I also think that like we tend to forget about men in these conversations, or men, like sexual assault against men is used to like within arguments about sexual assault against women. But I think that why the reason why men are silenced about their sexual assault is because first of all, the patriarchy, this idea of like male dominance, of like the man should have been able to overpower the woman, or there are notions and ideas about the dynamic between a male and a female within like a heterosexual encounter. And I think that's a huge issue, and I think that's why it's a men's issue as well, because I think because of like the culture of toxic masculinity and the rape culture, it affects men as well, because it boxes men into becoming like these emotionless beings who can't talk about their feelings, who can't talk about trauma, and who can't talk about stuff like sexual assault, because men aren't supposed to be like that. Men are supposed to be the dominant ones in the culture. And I think it's really important to address that as well, because when we're talking about rape culture, it affects women a lot, and it's very violent towards women, but a lot of the time it really does affect men, and it affects their mental health, and it reinforces toxic masculinity, which is extremely harmful to the young men currently living today. Daria, go first.
So I just wanted to talk about this TED Talk because I found it very, very interesting watching it, especially coming from a male. The person that was speaking in the TED Talk was, very passionate about the fact that it starts at the root cause of why rape is happening. It starts off with simple conversations with your sons and your dads and granddads, etc. Sort of like reforming the social norms of how a man should be, because I think what Zara said was very important. The fact that men are seen as, well, they're told that they should be like emotionless, etc., which in turn sort of boxes in any sort of anger or aggression that they could have towards anyone or anything in their life. And sometimes taking again that social norm of men having to be stronger than women, or protecting women, that aggression can turn into assault and abuse and rape, even though perhaps the person never intended for that. So I think what was very interesting was he sort of said in order for all of this to sort of stop, the most important thing is to find men who will speak up and protect the rights of women in the most uplifting and supportive way, of course, and sort of stand their ground towards other men. So he gave an idea, like an example of where a few men were, playing poker, and someone made a sexist comment, and he said that men should be the people that in that situation would say, no, that's wrong, you shouldn't be saying that, and sort of protecting, it's quite hard to sort of be an advocate for something that you might not necessarily relate to. But he was saying, start thinking about your sisters, your moms, your grandmothers, your nieces, etc., and see how quickly your perception of all of this changes. So I think what was very interesting for me particularly was the whole not stopping women from being vocal and using, sadly, the power that men have against women, to use it in a powerful and positive light in order to re-encourage all of the work that women have been putting into through all of the movements, such as like the Me Too movement.
I think yeah. I mean, that was a really I mean, I actually really enjoyed that talk. I thought he made a lot of sense, and I mean, yeah, when he spoke about the fact that men, we like to make jokes about like sexism and stuff like that. I mean, I won't lie. I'll be honest. Yes, in the past, I've me and my mates we made jokes about it and stuff like that. Not saying we have never said. I mean, we've always believed in equal rights and everything, but it's very easy to. I mean, I'd say what at least 90% of men have made jokes about this topic, but obviously we don't have the intention. We don't want to be harmful in any way, but it's just a natural thing. And when we make jokes about it, we don't actually think about the consequences of it. And I think when he spoke about it, and when he spoke about the fact that I mean, it actually starts with the jokes. It starts with these light conversations that we have. And I think stopping them and actually realizing that it's really not healthy at all is actually a good way to stop it as a whole. So I mean, yeah, I think he made a lot of sense with that.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, because like he was talking about how like a lot of this stuff is easier said than done, and I want to ask like the guys here, have you ever? I mean, you don't have to speak on it. You can just speak in general, but like, have you ever spoken up against abusive men within your own social circles? And like, do you think that it's hard, particularly because of, I think, the toxic masculinity that is so pervasive within a lot of cultures? Has it been hard, or like have you personally found it hard to call out men and other men on their abusive behavior? Like,
I think this is actually what makes it such a hard, concept as a whole, because I mean, I can tell you from my experience with my mates and stuff like that. None of us have ever advocated, I mean, assault towards women or anything like that. And even if any of our mates have even inferred it, I mean, I'm quite confident that we would shut that down instantly. But yet, I mean, I've seen things that some of my mates have done which they haven't spoken to us about, or they haven't inferred they would actually do. So it's very hard to spot it out, and it's what makes this such a hard topic. Because usually when you have issues in the world, I mean, okay, take for example the last issue that we had, there are often ways that you can tell this is going to lead up to an issue. You can find correlations, you can find things that lead up to it. But this issue as a whole is so hard. I mean, if we look at a case like James Alexander, who could have told? I mean, what clues was he leaving to make us assume, the person he was? And that happens with a lot of these cases, which is why it's very hard to look at to find a root cause, to find a common synergy that leads to boys to actually reach this level. And yeah, that's why I just think this is a very, very hard, issue to solve. But yeah.
Um, yeah, I do agree with Sham, especially the point that he made about how sometimes it's very hard to spot it. And it's not like we don't want to, it's just sometimes we don't see it. And then also I've seen like in some places, like in social media as well, that they keep saying that men uh, can live or like be around people who they know have violated or assaulted women. And my view on that is that sometimes it's not that we don't want to speak out, it's just that we don't see it. And like, believe me, in my experience at least, once we do know that he is doing something wrong, um at least in my experience, like a group of friends, we like confronted him about it. um and yes, like what Sham said as well, sometimes it's quite hard to see what will happen in the long run. So um what I'm trying to say is that if we can get like a really good view of what's happening, then yes, at least in my experience, I've managed to confront someone who actually done it. But it's just really hard to do it because it's really hard to like see it happening with your own eyes. And like, it's hard to like imagine that one of your friends, yes, has actually like assaulted women. Yeah, that's all for me.
yeah, speaking on that, I think that's really great that you guys like would actively call out your friends, I guess, or like your mates or whatever, about if they were being abusive towards women. Do you think that perhaps the fact that rape jokes and, you know, misogynistic sort of snide comments are so normalized in our culture, do you think that might be a reason why it's so hard to spot? Because I think, like, as I've said before, a lot of the stuff that we think is normal and we think is okay to us is actually rooted in, like, you know, misogyny, and it's rooted in rape and violence. Like, do you think that perhaps if, you know, we had talks and, you know, conversations with people about, like, you know, let's reconsider what we think is okay, let's reconsider what we think is like normal in our culture, do you think that perhaps that would make it easier for people to like call out abusive behavior? Because I think like that's fair what you're saying, but I think that there are some times where like I guess like women particularly can really clearly see when a man is being abusive but their friends can't, and it's like, okay, not to say that that's you, but like in general a lot. Like, what do you guys think?
I think it would really be helpful if like we can like as a society like clarify what's wrong and what's not, so that we can like, identify when it's like too much, you know? Because
Yeah.
like Sham said, like I can also like attest to that, that more often than not, a lot of people have like made jokes about these kind of stuff, and again, not all of us has the intention to like violate a woman's right in our conversation, but it's just that it just happens, you know. So like if we can like specifically know like this is too much, then I think it would really be helpful to stop that conversation from going on.
Yeah, and I think hegemonic masculinity has a large part to play as well, because it's been so ingrained in, you know, young boys culture at this point, where it's just very hard to, you know, to stand up against. And, you know, you can only stand up against something if you realize it. But because of this hegemonic masculinity, rarely do we actually realize that what we're saying could actually, you know, possibly be harmful. And I mean, and again, this relates back to, you know, how men, you know, how it's very hard for us to, you know, speak about our feelings and so on with other men because of, you know, expectations and so on, and why that very rarely happens. And I think, you know, as long as hegemonic masculinity persists in our culture, you know, it'll be very hard to make changes in the norms of how we, you know, interact with each other. But yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay, New raised your hand.
I just wanted to pose the question, like, obviously, um, we talk about this, we acknowledge it, we learn about it, we're informed, but in our social circles, between our friends, with this thing of bants and like just joking around, where do we draw the line? What's okay, what's not? Rape jokes, things like that. Like, how can we? I think that's also a problem. Oh my God, a problem with like, you know, jokes and things like that. Because if you call someone out, like the boys want called someone out, they get called simp. If you know, things like that, and they only are able to admit things are wrong if someone called them out, if they've actually done it, if they've actually like got evidence. But if you've done it, then it's too late, right? So if you want to call someone out before it happens, how do we do that? What's okay to joke about, you know? Just something to think about.
I think again that's like this whole thing about like what do we consider okay? Like a lot of the stuff that like the rape jokes, like I know for a fact, like I've seen it, I've experienced it, I've witnessed it. Like people just really like to brush it aside as like, oh, they're just like jokes. It's not meant to be offensive. But people, I guess they don't understand like the consequences of saying that. And I think like what New was saying, like, you know, that's just the starting point. But somebody could already be perpetuating abuse and you just either you don't want to see it or you can't really see it because you don't know enough about it. And I think it really has to start with like those uncomfortable conversations about, you know, rape jokes and about sexist jokes that people make that like they're not really that funny and they're not okay, like at all. And I think you know, unfortunately, like hegemonic masculinity and toxic masculinity makes it really hard for men to have like these constructive conversations because, as you said, they're like called a simp, or they said like, oh, you're so sensitive, or like you take things too seriously, or you're like excluded from friend groups for calling your abusive friends out. And I think that's like a huge issue that I don't think it's something that women necessarily can address because those are within male circles. And we've sort of already established that it's really hard for women within male spaces to do that because we obviously, unfortunately, we don't have that power. Sham.
I would argue, Zara, that you guys actually do have that power. And I mean, looking at this right now, I mean, I think Akmal can agree with me as well. This has been really eye-opening because, we've gotten the perspective of you guys. And as long as we only engage and as long as, we only talk with other boys about, these things, we aren't going to get the perspective of how you guys feel when we speak about this stuff, which is why it'll never change. So when we hear you guys speak about how you feel and your perspective, it makes it a lot easier to sympathize with you guys, and I think that can really help it out. So I think
Yeah.
more of these talks would be really helpful. But yeah.
Yeah, that's true. New raised her hand.
I just wanted to ask, obviously, not my opinion. I do agree with everything that's being said, but some would say if it's within their circle, if it's not getting out, there's no females hearing this, things like that, um, they would argue that joking about it is fine. And
Yeah,
how do we explain whether it is okay or whether it's not, if it's not getting out, if it's just between, one or two people, not one, two or three people, um, joking around, having some fun, because obviously we can't remove humor from everything. Um, what is okay, like, is it okay if it stays within their circle, stays there, and it doesn't get out and it doesn't offend anyone? It's just a joke between, two guys laughing or something like that.
Akmal.
So I was gonna ask you guys, the girls, in this conversation, like since we're already like talking about what's okay and what's not okay, what would be like examples of like conversations that you probably hear like us boys talking about that would uh that you feel like we should not joke about?
Sort of like tie that into my point. We were talking about how we have friends, maybe that are our age, who joke around about this, but personally, I've witnessed this within teachers as well. So I know
Mm,
that um, some of us might know a certain teacher who would make sort of jokes about women in the kitchen, all of those sort of comments. And as a student who, who's trying to, I'm not going to name drop Sham, um, but yeah, so I think that as a student, as like a girl who is trying to sort of make make myself like, just like trying to live my life, having comments like that from someone who is supposedly of authority becomes even more like degrading. And I've heard it from other teachers towards women that are their age as well, mentioning sort of she belongs in the kitchen, or I'll tell her what to do, etc. And they play it off as jokes, but when is enough enough? And like touching on Akmal's point, I think any kind of degrading statement towards a woman is unacceptable, whether it be about, her intellectual level, her body, if she's easy or not. Um, and I also kind of want to touch on something that I just sort of was thinking about. Of course, all of these problem lies within men and their society, but it could also be transferred to girls. We sometimes jokingly call other girls, names that could be seen as sexualizing them, etc. When in reality, that's not the case, and the girl, isn't that whatsoever, and she can do whatever she wants, and that's up to her. But we sometimes are being very vocal about the names that we use towards other girls that almost make it seem like we're okay with all of these jokes. So I think it goes both ways. Um, yeah, okay, it goes both ways. To sort of stop the issues between men's societies, women's societies, and just rape culture in general. I don't think it's always necessarily, you know, men needing to solve this. I think it also starts with girls and their small groups and stopping to sexualize women, degrading women based on any factor whatsoever.
Yeah, I completely agree with Daria. I think that like a lot of the stuff that like I've seen people say like in our year group about like women going back to the kitchen, about like the one-off jokes about like, women, going back to the kitchen, or like women don't have rights, or like why are women on the left because they don't have any rights, or some stupid shit like that. Um, like because the thing is, it starts there. It's like a seed, and then it grows into something worse, and then you keep thinking it's okay. And New was talking about like, what if it's between friends? Even if it's between friends, call it out, because that's where abuse starts. That's where, like, because you think it's okay to discuss it among your friends, so, and like maybe you don't say it out in public, but you still harbor those mindsets, and you need to like actively call it out, even if it makes you uncomfortable. And like, I don't know. I feel like the same way about, women, and like how women talk about each other. I think there's a lot of like women who unfortunately pit themselves against each other. Like it's perfectly valid to like not like someone because they're not nice. But I think like women and men like to, use words like slut, whore, easy, stuff like that. And it normalizes rape culture, and it makes it harder for like, people to speak up about their abuse. Because like, what if everyone, like, you call people slut and you joke around about people being a slut, and if they do get assaulted, then what happens? They're known as like your group slut, and it just becomes harder for people to like, for them to legitimize their abuse, and for other people to actually want to pay attention to what's going on to them. And i think I think while like women also need to address this, I think men really do need to start picking up, the weight, because like I think a lot of women are just tired. Like I am so tired. Like if I have to hear more like sexist jokes, it's gonna be like the straw on the camel's back, because I might just get like super annoyed. So Sham, you raise your hand.
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I just thought that was a really good point, and I think it should start from us. I mean, it should start from norms around how we interact with each other, and But I mean, yeah. So the main reason I put my hand up was I actually just wanted to ask you guys. I mean, have you? I mean, obviously, again, I'm not saying you guys may do any of this, but have you seen women speak about men, maybe in the same way that you guys would say that we, speak about you guys in a quite a harmful way?
I will admit that like I do say I make jokes about like female superiority, and I make jokes and say men are trash, but I think I need to clarify that, and I want to like clear the room and say like, when I say men are trash, I think I don't know if I don't know if my words have any power the same way that a man's words might have, about like if they were calling a woman a slut or something, because there's like a history of dominance of the patriarchy. And when I say that, it's obviously like a shoe fits thing. Like if you don't act in the way that like perpetuates abuse, that it perpetuates sexual harassment and like rape jokes and sexism, then like I'm not talking about you. But I don't know. I think that women can, in some way, unfortunately, talk about men, like say like be a man, or like perpetuate gender roles that are harmful and uphold toxic masculinity and the patriarchy. So like I think that like what you're saying is like totally valid. Oh, Jonathan, hello, has joined. So yeah, I mean, that's all I have to say. But I am playing the air because like I know people are gonna come for me and say like, but Zara, you say men are trash. And like, yeah, I say that, but like it's if the shoe fits. Like if you are not perpetuating abuse and harassment, then like I'm not talking about you.
I
I
think
just want,
also a
sorry.
slightly different um, sort of look on it would be like girls calling boys fuckboys. I don't know if I don't know. I think that also sort of is like the equivalent of calling a girl a slut. So sort of sometimes we label boys as fuckboys if they might be like talking to a few girls at once. Maybe it's not romantic whatsoever, and he just perhaps has many female friends, and that sort of flips around. It's like calling a guy fuck boy, or sort of like not sexualizing men, but sort of saying like, oh, he's attractive, so and so, and so that can also be seen as sort of like degrading men as well. So to flip it around, Sean, yes, I think girls are also guilty of this. However, as we've seen, like, track record of sort of rape and assault, it sort of does flip more towards men, and how they speak about women. However, we can all, well, maybe not all of us, but some of us can agree that girls are also guilty of sort of sometimes making sort of sexual jokes about boys that maybe have like zero interest in girls whatsoever, but we sort of label it and don't think about it enough. So yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna add like exactly what Daria just said. If we're talking purely on the basis of conversations between friends, calling people fuckboys, saying they think that they're dicks, like calling people rapists as a joke, like, um, obviously through reading all of this and listening, and you know, it is really interesting and it opens my eyes up, and it kind of makes these jokes really not okay anymore. But at the same time, this might get controversial, but like if we are, you know, because men are mainly the kind of, okay, men are usually pointed at saying like they are the ones doing this and all that, and therefore females take on this kind of conversation and joining it and pointing fingers as well. And I think that paints a wrong picture, and it also kind of gets everyone worked up and gets everyone upset and angry, when in reality, especially within our community, the situations aren't as serious as they are in the real world. So I think we should, be educating rather than calling these kind of names and dividing the two sexes because of the norm in society, if that makes sense.
Like I sort of agree with that. I just think that, I don't know, in my experience, like having ever called men out on this, it never seems to work. Um, because I don't know if people are receptive or as receptive as we hope they are. But like that being said, I think that, both men and women are absolutely guilty of making rape jokes. Like I know so many women who make rape jokes, and eat as much as men, and I don't think like either gender engaging in that kind of behavior is acceptable at all. And I think it's on both of, any person of any gender identity to sort of take accountability and start unlearning what we're so used to in our culture and in our society. Yeah, so I think everyone's made really great points, and I guess this is leading on to our concluding point, which is basically how do we eradicate this problem of rape culture in the remainder of the 21st century, and is it possible, and do we rely on making this known in law, or is it about a cultural shift and like a paradigm shift in our culture? So Daria has raised her hand. Oh, a lot of people are raising their hands. Daria, go first.
So I think to like conclude, I guess from watching the TED Talk specifically about if it's a men's issue, I feel like a longer but more effective process would be to socially reform the way men are seen in society. I think the root cause of all of this is the so-called power in quotes that has been given to men over women, and I think starting from that and um, making sort of sexism and rape jokes, etc., like not okay um, in the social sort of like situation, um, is a way of sort of combating the issues of rape and assault and abuse, because in my opinion everything starts from those little jokes, little conversations, sort of like the masculinity that men have from their social like class that has been given to them, just the way like social like socially everything's been constructed to be. So I think that the best way to reform and repair and sort of prevent any sort of abuse from happening would be from the root causes conversations with your sons and your dads and granddads and nephews, etc. So
I
Yeah.
can't remember if it's Sham or New. Oh, it's Sham.
Yeah, so I think in terms of how we solve it, I mean, almost everything has been said in this call, and I think the very concept of this call is how we solve it. I mean, it's about educating, it's about leadership as a whole, as he was saying in the talk, and I think the more men my age or younger than me or older than me are able to sympathize with how women may feel. I mean, the more understanding we actually become in this situation. And I think in terms of how this education actually happens, I mean, yes, you can have it through schools and your teachers and so on, but I think if you really want to make a cultural shift, education needs to come from us. It needs to come from the actual people that interact with the people who are making these sorts of jokes and who are saying all of these kinds of things. And I think leadership in this case really comes from the people who are involved in the actual thing. And I think situations like these where me, Akmal, and John are here, you know right now we're being fed a perspective on the other side of the people that we may or may not have heard of, made jokes about. And I think this is exactly how you solve the issue, in my opinion.
I think pretty much Daria and Sham summed it up, but I don't know. I either have a really pessimistic view on this or I haven't thought enough about this, but I think in society, I don't think we will ever eradicate rape like a disease. I don't think it could ever be completely 100% gone. I think there will always exist a few individuals in society who are sick-minded, um, because that's how a population usually is. No one is the same. No one thinks the same. There will always be a few people. In terms of moving forward with this, though, I think with rape, it will also move forward for the better as women's rights move forward, as sexism um, becomes more, just wrong, as equality becomes more accepted, as society moves forward, basically. And with with that, I think requires social reforms, like Daria said, and Sham said, like in education, start young, and as well as in institutions, and just there isn't one way you can attack this problem. There isn't one kind of discipline you can go about it. It has to come from every aspect of society, and I think that's going to take a long time. I don't think it'll ever fully be eradicated, but if we can move forward, I think it starts from conversations such as these, and education. Yeah.
I totally agree with what everyone said, and I think that perhaps the first thing that we need to do when talking about rape in our society is because, like we said at the very beginning, a lot of people view rape as this violent act committed by, like, I guess, low-class criminals or something, when in reality it can be, perpetrated by like a billionaire or like a really high-class dude, because it just goes to show that, rape is a societal issue. It stems from the jokes that we tell and we think that are okay that are not. It stems from like the casual sexism, the benevolent sexism. And I think that, like, from the reading, the last reading about benevolent sexism and how that basically creates the two, like, very distinct separate gender roles, I think in order to dismantle this culture of rape and dismantle benevolent sexism and to dismantle the patriarchy, we need to start dismantling. I know I'm getting like really theoretical here, kind of gender critical, but like dismantle ideas of gender and dismantle like these societally created and culturally created perceptions of gender and what they are, because I think that's what's most harmful, is that men and women think that they're two separate entities when in reality they're exactly the same. Yeah, and I think that's really important. And like Sham was saying and Daria was saying, as Nu was saying, it's about like educating. And I think that actually, I think the sex ed programs that we have in a lot of schools today are unfortunately inequipped and like poorly equipped to talk properly about consent. And I think more conversations need to happen between parents to their sons and even to their daughters about like you should not rape, rather than how to protect yourselves from rape. The conversation needs to be recentered around do not rape rather than how do you protect yourself, because I don't think that anybody should live in a world where they can't do normal things and they can't be normal people because they are too afraid to walk outside at night for fear of getting assaulted. Yeah. Akmal.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone said. But also want to like reemphasize the importance of having conversation about these this kind of stuff, like this topic about rape culture and everything, especially between boys and girls. Um, so this reminded me of an incident that happened in my old school. It happened like after I left. But it was okay. So basically, there was a teacher who I was really close to. He got fired, and in like my alumni group chat, I was like quite furious, like, oh, why did he get fired, And then all of a sudden, I got attacked by like the other girls in my group because apparently he was fired because of sexual assault. And this was really surprising to me because like all this while, I didn't know that he was actually doing that, and apparently he had done that to one of my closer friends, girls as well. So I was just really shocked at how something like this can get away without like um me knowing, or like in that case, like the other boys knowing, because I think in that case, the girls just probably like kept to themselves and they didn't really like want to voice out what happened. Especially they didn't really talk to the boys about what were happening. So I think one um thing that could actually help solve this problem, well, not solve, but like contribute to like resolving this issue, is to have more conversations between boys and girls on this kind of topic, which I would say is kind of like a taboo in Malaysia because you don't really hear like boys and girls talking about this topic very much. Yeah.
Okay, Nu.
I just want to quickly add on to that. In my old school, there was also a rape case as well, where two teachers, got accused of rape by a parent of a child, and it all turned out to be wrongfully accused, all that. But when this blew up, we were all forbidden to like talk about it. If we spoke about it, we would be sent home. Um, we wouldn't be allowed to talk about it during breaks, lunch, and if they found out any of us talked about it on social media, we would be suspended. All things like that. And then now that I think about it, we also had health classes, or sex ed, as you call it, in middle school, and I thought that was great. I thought we got to learn things like that quite early on, but then I realized the things I learned in health class was we got plastic babies and had plastic feeding tubes and all that for the babies. Like there wasn't anything that was of real value for that like for that age, and now that I think about it, there wasn't one um lesson on consent. There wasn't one lesson on rape. We weren't able to talk about it, and I think that's a real problem. And I understand that we were quite young, but it was also middle school, and if you read about one or two cases, you would even find that they're quite young as well, and we need to learn about this. We need to talk about it, even though it's uncomfortable, even though it's cruel to have such like an innocent child be stripped away of, you know, their childhood fantasies of like happy world, but in reality the world has moved to this stage now where we need to educate people on that. And as Akmal said, like it's shocking and etc. But I just found it quite unsettling that we weren't able to discuss it, draw comfort from it, learn something from it. The school just brushed it off. So yeah.
I think adding on to that, I think that there also needs to be, you know, a shift where we start, you know, really believing victims. And I think a lot of people are scared, like, you know, like news story about how it was actually a false accusation. And maybe we should reconsider that a lot of the times, you know, it's not, there's a really low statistic of false accusations, and we need to start believing victims, because when we create that safe space and that safe culture, then it allows for people to come forward about their abuse and about their assaults. And I think that in that we create a more healthy culture for victims to sort of heal, and for actual healthy conversations to happen around sexual assault. And I think that we need to first start by educating about consent. We need to start believing victims, and we need to start being able to have these healthy conversations that don't end in like jokes or calling people sensitive. But yeah, I think like what we're doing today and the conversations we're having among men and women are really critical and really crucial to dismantling the rape culture and to, you know, healing this really horrible issue of, you know, sexual assault and sexual harassment that has occurred to more people than we know. Yeah, so I guess that's, I'm gonna do like my podcast voice because like this is the end. If anyone wants to add anything on, but this is like the end of week 2. We discussed rape culture, and if you're tuning in and you're listening and you want to access the resources that we talked about today, visit our website, which is theopenbook.card.co, and there's a link to a resources folder where you can access all the resources that we've talked about beginning from week 1. So yeah.